Hello and welcome to this class of Principles of Microeconomics. I am your teacher, Nadeem Sarwar. Today we shall continue our discussion on consumer behavior. This is our third lecture on this topic. In this lecture, we shall study how a change in exogenous factors, that is, a change in income and prices, affects consumer choice. Then we shall study how we can break down price effect into income effect and substitution effect for normal, inferior and given goods. So let's start with the lecture. Students, in the previous lecture we studied ordinal approach and we studied that to model consumers' consumption choices following ordinal approach, we use indifference curve and budget line. An indifference curve shows various combinations of two commodities that give consumer same level of satisfaction, whereas a budget line shows which bundles of two commodities a consumer can afford and which bundles are unaffordable, given the income and the prices. So, in this model, consumer chooses various quantities of good X and Y, whereas the prices and incomes are taken as given. We already know that the variables that are taken as given in a model are called exogenous variables, whereas the variables for which model solves and gives their value are called endogenous variables. Therefore, the quantities of X and Y are endogenous variables and the prices and the income are exogenous variables of this model. Now we see how a change in exogenous variables changes the consumer choices. First, let's revise what happens when there is a change in income or a change in price. When income increases, it enables consumer to purchase more of both goods. So this is represented on the graph by the shift of budget line. However, when the price of a commodity decreases, the slope changes. It enables consumer to purchase more of that goods maximum quantity. Now let's first talk about the income effect. That is, what happens when the income of the consumer changes whereas the prices of both commodities remain the same. Students, we know that the goods can be categorized as normal goods or inferior goods. Normal goods are those for which the demand increases with an increase in income. Let's assume that both the commodities are normal goods. Given the income and the prices, consumer is in equilibrium at point E1. Now let's assume that the income of the consumer increased. This resulted in shifting of the budget line and consumer moved to higher indifference curve. He is in equilibrium where the new budget line is tangent to the new indifference curve, represented by point E2. If we join both these points E1 and E2 with a curve, such a curve is called income consumption curve. Now the inferior good case. The inferior goods are those for which an increase in income results in decreasing their quantity demanded. An increase in income results in decreasing their demand. Now let's assume that consumer is in equilibrium at point E1 where the initial budget line is tangent to indifference curve 1. Now the income of the consumer increased. Assuming good X as inferior good, the consumer will shift his resources towards normal good, that is the good Y, and purchase less of good X, which we labeled as inferior good. This is represented by point E2. Again, joining E1 and E2, we have income consumption curve, and we can see that the income consumption curve bends towards the normal good. Now the effect of change in price. We know that a change in price of any good will result in changing the slope of budget line. Let's assume that a consumer is in equilibrium at E1 given his income and the prices of both commodities. Now let's assume that price of commodity X decreased. This resulted in rotation of the budget line. It extended towards x-axis, showing that now consumer is able to purchase more maximum quantity of commodity X. Now the consumer's budget now the consumer's indifference curve also shifted. He moved to higher indifference curve labeled as IC2. The equilibrium point is where the budget line is tangent to indifference curve. This is at point E2. Now joining E1 and E2, we have price consumption curve. Next is the same case of decrease in the price of X. However, the nature of commodity is changed. Let's first examine it, how it is represented graphically, and then we shall talk about the nature of the commodity. Again, the consumer is in equilibrium where the budget line is tangent to IC1, that is at point E1. Again, assuming that price of commodity X decreased, budget line rotated, the consumer shifted to higher indifference curve. Now the equilibrium is at E2. Again, joining E1 and E2, we have price consumption curve. However, here there is a big difference. If you look at first diagram, there is a very large change in the quantity demand of X. However, in this presently drawn diagram, there is a small change in the quantity demanded of commodity X. In fact, the higher resources because of decrease in the price of commodity X were spent on purchasing more of both goods. This shows that in this case, the commodity X is not as preferable as it was in previous case. This is the case of inferior commodity. Here we are assuming that commodity X is inferior commodity. So for inferior commodities, if there is a decrease in the price, their quantity demanded also increases, but not as much as in case of normal goods. Now the third case of given good. Students, for the given goods, in fact, with an increase in the price, their quantity demanded increases, and with a decrease in the price, their quantity demanded also decreases. This is shown in the third diagram, where the consumer was initially at equilibrium at point E1. However, because of decrease in the price of X, which is a given good, consumer shifted to higher indifference curve IC2. Equilibrium point is E2. However, the consumption of X decreased. We shall now talk more about given good, then we should proceed to the remaining lecture. Given goods are those goods for which the quantity demanded is positively related to the price. These commodities are in fact inferior goods, but they have a large share in the budget. And for these goods, income effect is greater than substitution effect. For the last point, we shall come to it later. Students, remember, the given goods case is a very special case. The examples of given goods are hard to find in real life. However, given our lifestyle, we can probably say, not surely, but we can probably say that wheat may be a given commodity. A decrease in the price of wheat will result in quite much savings, and that saving may be spent on consuming fruits, milks, restaurant meals, and that may result in actually decreasing the quantity demand of the wheat. But we are not certain about it, about the example. There is another confusion about the given goods. There are some goods that are bought to show off higher living standards. And we observe that when their price increases, their quantity demand also increases. However, keep in mind that these are not given goods. The person who buys such a good actually buys two goods. It's a two-in-one package. One is the good itself, and second is its prestige value. So, when the price goes up, the prestige value attached to the good increases. This increase in the prestige value pursues person to purchase it in higher quantity. Keep in mind that given goods are actually inferior commodities. Prestige goods are not inferior by any means, so they cannot be given. Now, the case of substitution effect. By substitution effect, we mean what happens when the price of a good changes, but consumers' real income remains the same. That is, the price of the good changes, but the income of the consumer also adjusts so that the purchasing power or the real income remains the same. What will be the effect of consumption in such a situation? This question is answered by substitution effect. So first let's look at the diagram. Initially, the consumer is in equilibrium at point E1, where the budget line AB is tangent to indifference curve. The price of the commodity X decreased. This resulted in rotation of budget line. However, the income of the consumer, the take-home income, also decreased, so that the purchasing power remained the same. This decrease in the income resulted in backward shifting of budget line. The new budget line AC will in fact shift backward, and it will shift that much as the purchasing power should remain the same as it was on E1. According to J.R. Hicks, this can be represented by shifting the budget line so much as it becomes tangent to original indifference curve. This happens when the new budget line, which is also called as compensated budget line, represented by FG, becomes tangent to original indifference curve at point E2. Now we can see that the price of X decreased, consumer is purchasing more of it, but since the real resources are same, so actually consumer is sacrificing the commodity Y and purchasing more of commodity X. Students, keep in mind that this shifting of budget line so that it becomes tangent to original indifference curve is J.R. Hicks' idea. There is another group of economists which is led by Slutsky. According to them, the shifting should be so much that the new budget line should pass from the old chosen bundle. That is, the new budget line should pass from E1. However, we shall stick to what J.R. Hicks suggested. Now the second part. In this part, we shall discuss how when the price of a good changes and its quantity demand increases, how we can break down this whole process into the income effect and the substitution effect. First, we are discussing the case of normal goods. Students, let's assume that initial budget line of the consumer is AB. His indifference curve is IC1. He is in equilibrium at point E1, consuming OP quantity of good X. Let's assume that price of X decreased. This resulted in rotation of budget line to AC. The IC also changed from IC1 to IC2. The equilibrium point is now E2 and the consumption of commodity X is now at OR. Therefore, the total effect of the change in income is OR minus OP. Now let's break it down into substitution effect and income effect. For the substitution effect, let's assume that despite the price decreased, there is no change in real income. In this case, the budget line will no more be AC. In fact, the budget line will be FG. That is, the budget line AB will pivot to FG, and the new budget line FG will be tangent to old indifference curve IC1 at point E1. The consumer is now consuming OQ quantity of commodity X. Therefore, the substitution effect is from OP to OQ, that is OQ minus OP. Now, in the final step, let's assume that the monetary income taken back in step 2 is given back to the consumer. This shifts budget line to AC. The consumer will move to IC2, equilibrium will be at E2, and the consumption will of commodity X will be OR. Therefore, the income effect is OR minus OQ, final value minus initial value. So, putting it in equation, price effect equal income effect plus substitution effect, and simplifying it, we have OR minus OP equals OR minus OP. The same is shown by the arrows in the diagram. Now let's study the same when commodity X is inferior good. Again, we assume that initial budget line is AB, indifference curve is IC1, consumer is in equilibrium at E1, consuming OP quantity of commodity X. Assume that the price of X decreased, the budget line rotated to AC, consumer moved to IC2, equilibrium point shifted to E2, and the consumption of X changed to OR. So price effect is final value minus initial value. Now let's break it down and let's assume that despite the price decreased, there is no change in the real income. Therefore, the budget line will no longer be AC. In fact, the AB will part to FG. New equilibrium will be at E3 and the consumption of X will be OQ. So the substitution effect is OQ minus OP. Now let's assume that because of decrease in the price, the real income is allowed to adjust. So the real income will increase. This will result in shifting the budget line from FG to AC. However, since commodity X is inferior, therefore the demand for commodity X will decrease. The new equilibrium will be at point E2, indifference curve IC2. Therefore, the income effect will be OR minus OQ in opposite direction to substitution effect. Again, putting all these effects in the equation and cancelling, we get OR minus OP equal to OR minus OP. In this diagram, we can see that income effect and substitution effect are in opposite directions. However, substitution effect dominates income effect. Therefore, the final price effect moves in the direction of substitution effect. Now let's study the case when commodity X is inferior good. Again, initial budget line is AB, IC is IC1, equilibrium is at E1, and consumer is consuming OP quantity of commodity X. Assuming that price of X decreased, now the budget line is rotated to AC, indifference curve shifted to IC2, equilibrium chain to E2 and the consumption of X is OR. Since X is inferior commodity, therefore a decrease in the price resulted in decreasing the quantity demanded of commodity X. Now to break it down into income effect and substitution effect. First, let's assume that despite the decrease in the price, the real income is same. Therefore, the budget line will no more be AC. In fact, it will be FG, which will be tangent to IC1 at E3. The consumption of commodity X will be OQ. So the substitution effect is OQ minus OP. Now finally we assume that when the price of the commodity X decreased, the real income also allowed to adjust, that is, it is allowed to increase. So as the real income increased, the budget line FG will shift to AC, and since commodity X is an inferior commodity, in fact it is given, but we know that given goods are also special case of inferior goods. So there will be a decrease in the demand of commodity X. The income effect is OR minus OQ. Again, putting it in the equation and solving, we have left hand side equal to right hand side. Again, note that in case of given goods, the substitution effect and income effect move in opposite directions. However, now the income effect dominates the substitution effect. This resulted in moving the quantity demanded in opposite direction. Summing up, for the normal good, let's assume that its price increased. We break down it into income effect and substitution effect. Assuming that because of increase in the price, the income of the consumer or purchasing power will decrease, so the demand for normal good will decrease. Here, substitution effect also results the same. So finally, because of an increase in the income, the quantity demanded of the commodity will decrease. If you look at the direction of the arrow showing the price effect and then the change in demand due to income effect, we can see that these are in opposite direction. Therefore, we say that the income effect of price change is negative. Same is the case with substitution effect. Second is the case of inferior good. Again, we assume that the price of inferior good increased and we break it down into income effect and substitution effect. Because of increase in the price, the real income will decrease. And since the good is inferior, so a decrease in income will result in higher demand of that good. The substitution effect is same in all cases. Therefore, because of substitution effect, the consumer will substitute this commodity for high priced commodities, for low priced with low priced commodities. Therefore, its demand will decrease. Now, since for inferior commodities, the income effect is weaker and substitution effect is stronger. So finally, because of increase in the price, the quantity demand will decrease, but not as much as in case of normal good. Again, look at the direction of arrow of change in demand due to income effect because of change in price. These are in same direction. That means the income effect of a change in price in case of normal goods is positive, whereas it is negative, whereas the substitution effect of a change in price is negative. Third is the case of given goods. Again, assume that the price of commodity increased and breaking it down into income and substitution effect. Because of increase in the price, the real income decreased, and since the given are also inferior goods, therefore their demand will increase. The substitution effect is same in all cases, that is, it will result in decrease in demand. However, in case of given goods, the income effect dominates substitution effect. Therefore, the overall impact of increase in price is increase in the quantity demanded. Here again, the income effect is positive and the substitution effect is negative. That's all for this lecture. Please post your questions and give your feedback in comments. Also consider liking and sharing the video and subscribing the channel. Thank you and goodbye.